In the mountain observatory, the narrator watched Dr. Elena Cross chase the dark like a cartographer mapping storms, and the dome hummed as midnight chilled the glass. Elena said, "If the horizon hides the truth, we go closer." The control room glowed with graphs like restless constellations in captivity. A radio crackled, and Jonah Park said, "The interferometer flagged a spike from the galactic core." She leaned in, steady as a surgeon, and saw a rhythm like a heartbeat buried in noise. Elena said, "Someone scrubbed the metadata." The narrator felt the room narrow, a lens closing on a secret. An encrypted footer pulsed and named a restricted archive. Jonah said, "Access needs Marcus Vale." The dome rotated, and shadows crossed the consoles like tides. Elena said, "Vale locks doors to keep mirrors from reflecting him." The spike rose again, sharper now, as if the abyss had turned its face toward them. The narrator marked the pivot when curiosity hardened into vow. Elena said, "Open the archive, whatever it costs." Morning diluted the stars, and the narrator found Elena driving down the switchbacks with silence, riding shotgun. She replayed the spike like a confession that refused to end. Elena said, "Vale will claim the data is unstable." The city woke in sodium haze, as towers mirrored a thin sun. Jonah called, and his voice threaded caution into resolve. Jonah said, "There is a back door through maintenance credentials." Elena parked by the university archive where stones swallowed echoes. The lobby smelled of old paper and polished pride. Elena said, "If truth is caged, we test the bars." A plaque named the donors like constellations carved in brass. The elevator climbed with the patience of an old judge. The narrator marked how doubt became a corridor that only narrowed. Jonah said, "We get 10 minutes before logs rotate." Elena pressed her palm to the scanner and chose to proceed. The archive level opened like a sealed chapter, and the narrator followed Elena through aisles that smelled of ozone and dust. Rows of tape vaults waited like disciplined soldiers. Elena said, "Archive Vale sits behind legacy frames." Jonah mapped the network with a pen scratch on his palm. Jonah said, "Maintenance shells ping on the minute." A distant door closed with ceremonial slowness. Elena knelt, and her voice softened as if speaking to a locked violin. Elena said, "You remember how to sing." The terminal woke, and a cursor blinked like a heartbeat unsure of itself. The narrator caught a tremor in the air, a hush that precedes revelation or ruin. Jonah said, 9 minutes. Elena's hands moved with monk-like care as she reached past the interface for the thing that hurts and heals. The cursor held, then invited her in. The narrator noted the password field that refused every honest word, and Elena fed it the language of ghosts. A hidden pane unfolded, revealing a directory named with constellations that never rose. Elena said, "Vale hides truth under poetry." Inside, a redacted document wore scars like blackout constellations. Jonah said, "Check some mismatch on the public copy." The room seemed to lean toward the screen. Elena said, "Restore the shadow version." A soft hum deepened, and suppressed images bled back into frames of a circling throat of light. The narrator felt gravity enter the room like a stern guest, taking a seat. Jonah said, "Someone edited the horizon radius." Elena traced the altered value with a wary finger. She said, "We are not supposed to see this." The cursor blinked like a dare that would not be withdrawn. Before they could copy the archive, the narrator heard footsteps that wrote a verdict in the aisle. Professor Marcus Vale arrived with a calm that carried knives wrapped in silk. "Vale," said curiosity, "is a fine servant and a ruthless master." Elena did not move, and the monitors painted cold light on still faces. Jonah said, "We needed to check a checksum." Vale smiled with the patience of a glacier. "Vale," said, "the university will handle calibration." The spike graph hovered like a witness that feared to speak. Elena said, "Why redact a horizon that widens inward?" The air tightened, and another second fell like a sealed envelope. Vale said, "Because meaning requires boundaries." The narrator counted the moment truth learned the name of its warden. Elena let the window stay open and chose not to look away. Morning returned with an apologetic sun, and the narrator watched Elena circle the campus like a satellite, seeking a stable orbit. She weighed the cost of last night against the gravity of what widened inside the data. Jonah said, "Vale is already tightening logs." The chapel bell tolled as if caution had learned music. Elena said, "We need a cleaner lens on the horizon radius." A door opened on the physics annex, and Dr. Mira Alvarez stepped into the hall like a skeptic invited to a seance. Mira said, "I heard your dome rotated off schedule." The corridor smelled of chalk and solvent and disappointment. Elena sketched the spike from memory, and the whiteboard took the confession without judging it. Mira said, "If the radius grew, frame dragging changed the script." The narrator felt a corridor widen, because doubt liked company that argued well. Elena said, "Help me separate signal from choreography." They moved into a seminar room where light fell in clean stripes, and the narrator traced the geometry of trust across the table. Elena said, "Public data underreports the horizon by 6 sigma." Mira rubbed a temple as if numbers carried thorns. Mira said, "Then someone is grooming the noise floor." Jonah placed a drive on the table, and the object looked heavier than its size. Jonah said, "Raw captures from the maintenance shell." Silence held the room while the clock stared without blinking. Elena said, "If the horizon stretches inward, interior volume grows like a rumor that learned calculus." The metaphor unsettled everyone, and the narrator liked that. Mira said, "Test with independent interferometry before you accuse a dean." A distant cheer rose from a courtyard, as if another world had chosen simpler weather. Elena said, "Then we build a second ear." By evening, the narrator followed them to a rooftop where antennas bristled like tense thoughts. The city spread in patient squares, and wind read the cables like sheet music. Elena said, "We ghost their array and listen from higher ground." Jonah tuned a homemade loop that looked humble and bold. Jonah said, "We sample at narrow bands and let gravity write the tempo." Mira checked the horizon as clouds stitched themselves in gray patience. Mira said, "If we see the same stretch, we publish before they launder it." A soft hum rose, and the rig settled into a heartbeat that the roof learned to respect. Elena said, "The signal is faint, but it keeps its promise." The narrator felt the roof tilt toward the galactic core, though physics held still. Jonah said, "Someone is pinging our Mac." Elena said, "We finish the capture, and then we run." Night matured into a road that left the city behind, and the narrator kept time with mile markers that refused to hurry. They drove toward an abandoned radio field where rust remembered the last century. Elena said, "If interference follows, it is not the sky." Jonah watched the spectrum like a cardiologist who feared good news. Jonah said, "Ghost carriers at our tail, steady amplitude." Mira unfolded a map that smelled like storage and stubbornness. Mira said, "We triangulate with the old dishes and cut their eyes out of our frame." The stars claimed their rights, and the wind argued with dry grass. Elena said, "Point at the core, and let the night say whether it widens." The narrator found comfort in machines that agreed to listen without pride. Jonah said, "Capture rolling." Mira said, "If this holds, your dean will need a new story." Dawn rehearsed itself on the horizon, and the narrator watched fear choose a careful chair. The captures matched, and the widened radius refused to be polite. Elena said, "We write and we mirror it to strangers." Her voice carried the steadiness of a bridge that had learned wind. Jonah said, "Vale filed a maintenance blackout on university networks." The road home bent around a lake that pretended to be calm. Mira said, "Publish from the dome before the window closes." They crossed the parking lot where frost argued with sunlight. Vale waited by the entrance, as if patience were a weapon. Vale said, "You have borrowed tools that do not belong to you." Elena kept walking, because momentum was a kind of answer. The narrator knew Act 2 had traded caution for velocity. Elena said, "Then take it up with the horizon." The narrator watched the Senate chamber of the university fill with deliberate silence, a theater where Vale's voice carried the weight of law. "Vale," said, "our research stands on pillars of discipline, not reckless trespass." Elena sat 2 rows back, her gaze steady as if chiseling through stone. Jonah whispered, "He is moving to bury the spike under policy." The lights were bright but cold, amplifying every pause. Vale spread documents like shields forged of words, each stamped with red seals that bled authority. Elena said, "He wants us cornered before we stand." Mira leaned close, her voice barely a tremor. Mira said, "They've already drafted sanctions." The narrator marked how authority sharpened itself against discovery, and how silence could weigh more than sound. Elena said, "Then truth will need a sharper edge." Later, in a shadowed corridor, Vale approached with footsteps that echoed like verdicts. Vale said, "Curiosity without discipline turns into fire." Elena met his stare, her jaw unshaken. Elena said, "Fire burns chains as well as bridges." Jonah tensed, clutching the drive like it was heavier than iron. Vale's eyes narrowed with the patience of a hunter who already saw the snare tighten. Vale said, "You trespassed in archives that shape reputations." The corridor air was thick with dust and old varnish, history pressing on lungs. Mira said, "Threats only confirm the wound." The narrator marked how power wore politeness like a mask stretched thin. Elena said, "The wound is wider than you admit, and it bleeds light." The narrator followed them into the astronomy lab, where silence hummed with hidden rebellion. Elena spread their raw captures across 3 screens, light cutting into the dark. Elena said, "The data speaks the same story every time." Jonah ran simulations, graphs blooming like impatient vines. Jonah said, "The radius outpaces classical models." Mira rubbed her chin as though the numbers drew blood. Mira said, "If you publish, they will dismantle the dome and claim sabotage." The hum of cooling fans sounded like distant applause from ghosts. Elena said, "Then the sky itself will testify." The narrator felt the lab hold its breath, as though waiting for a verdict delivered by starlight. At dusk, the narrator found Elena alone in the observatory dome, her figure cut against a glowing simulation of a black hole's throat. Elena said, "If truth bends light, then lies bend men." The dome turned slowly, grinding like an ancient clock. Shadows circled her face, and her eyes reflected the spiral like twin event horizons. Jonah's voice on the intercom carried unease. Jonah said, "Vale filed injunctions against your credentials." Elena said, "Then I will let the stars credential me." The projection shimmered, a whirl of swallowed suns. The narrator noted how loneliness could sharpen into resolve when silence was this complete. That night in his office, the narrator watched Vale pour whiskey as if baptizing authority. Shelves of sealed reports lined the walls like witnesses forced to stay silent. Vale said, "Knowledge is not a right, it is a weapon." His reflection in the glass blurred into the city lights. He smirked, knowing locks multiplied faster than questions. Elena's voice came through the cracked comms from outside his door. Elena said, "A weapon is nothing if it fails to hit its mark." Vale turned, glass steady, a man convinced of his dominion. The narrator saw 2 wills sharpen like blades, and the air waited for the clash. The narrator carried us into the library archives where silence felt rehearsed, and shelves leaned in as if listening. A man named Adrian Kessler, once introduced as a researcher, joined them with a smile that seemed too polished. Adrian said, "I can help unlock hidden pathways in Vale's system." Elena studied him, her gray eyes weighing intent like scales testing false gold. Jonah frowned, sensing a seam behind the charm. Jonah said, "Why help us now?" Adrian chuckled softly. Adrian said, "Because I dislike monopolies on truth." Mira crossed her arms, her caution hanging like iron in the air. Mira said, "Or because you need us to step first into the trap." The narrator marked how allies sometimes arrived, dressed in doubt. Elena said, "If you have a key, show it." The narrator lingered in the campus cafe where shadows folded into chatter, and Adrian leaned forward with conspiratorial ease. Adrian said, "Veil mirrors data on a ghost server under the medical wing." Elena tapped her cup, her expression neutral but sharp. Elena said, "Why tell us what can undo you?" Adrian's grin softened into something colder. Adrian said, "Because undoing Veil protects me more than silence." Jonah leaned close, suspicion thick in his tone. Jonah said, "You sound like a man bargaining for survival." Mira stirred her coffee but did not drink. Mira said, "Or like someone ensuring we take the fall." The narrator felt the cafe shrink, as if walls conspired to hold secrets tight. Elena said, "Show us proof before we step into your shadow." By afternoon, the narrator watched them follow Adrian through subterranean halls beneath the medical wing, where pipes hissed like serpents. Adrian said, "Here lies the vault Veil cannot sanitize." Elena held her breath as terminal lights blinked alive, faint as fireflies. Jonah said, "If this is real, we mirror fast and vanish faster." Mira's eyes darted, every echo warning. Mira said, "This place smells of entrapment." Adrian's tone was calm, rehearsed. Adrian said, "Entrapment works only if you lack courage." The narrator marked the moment when every footstep felt like a confession recorded by stone. Elena said, "Then let the data speak louder than fear." The terminal whirred, and the narrator leaned close as forbidden images flickered. A simulation of collapse wider than theories allowed. Elena whispered, "The core swallows volume like lungs learning greed." Jonah's hands raced, capturing frames before alarms could wake. Jonah said, "Packets duplicating time-stamped off-cycle." Mira's eyes narrowed at the sudden red blink of a hidden alert. Mira said, "This vault screams trap." Adrian smiled faintly, as though the warning pleased him. Adrian said, "Knowledge is never free." The narrator marked the weight of betrayal unspoken, hanging between trust and trap battle. Elena said, "Then truth will demand a cost you cannot name." The narrator followed them as they fled the sublevels, alarms pulsing like a heartbeat gone wild. Footsteps thundered behind, but Adrian stayed calm, his expression unreadable. Elena said, "You triggered this." Adrian replied, "I opened the door. What follows proves your courage." Jonah clutched the mirrored drive as though carrying a fragile universe. Jonah said, "If this was bait, you get caught with us." Mira's voice carried fury, sharp as glass. Mira said, "He wants us marked." The corridor lights flickered, shadows snapping like jaws. Elena said, "Then let the shadows see us running toward truth, not away from it." The narrator marked Act 4 as the place where trust began to fracture, and masks grew teeth. The narrator led them into an abandoned research cabin on the edge of the desert where silence pressed like a confession. There, they met Clara Hughes, a woman whose eyes carried storms older than her voice. Clara said, "I once measured a horizon that swallowed more than stars." Elena studied her, hearing pain coded in every syllable. Jonah said, "Your logs predate Veil's tenure." Clara set a faded folder on the table, paper yellowed, edges bitten by time. Clara said, "My partner vanished the week we published this draft." Mira whispered, "The tragedy was no accident." The air thickened, carrying echoes of grief dressed in numbers. Elena said, "Show us what the stars kept from him." The narrator mocked how tragedy often hid the missing pieces. The narrator followed Clara as she unwrapped photographs faded by decades, each frame whispering secrets once silenced. Clara said, "We caught an anomaly. The radius changed within a single orbit." Elena leaned closer, her eyes sharpening like chisels on marble. Elena said, "That proves Veil knew more than he admits." Jonah adjusted the photos under pale light, his fingers careful. Jonah said, "These frames were erased from every digital record." Mira exhaled, steady but shaken. Mira said, "The loss of your partner was Veil's insurance." Clara's face carried the weight of love buried under absence. Clara said, I wanted silence, but silence turned into chains. The narrator felt tragedy pass from past to present, like fire passed hand to hand. The narrator carried them outside where desert winds swept sand like restless memory. Clara pointed at the horizon with trembling hands. Clara said, "He stood there before he disappeared, staring at a sky that had no mercy." Elena's gaze followed, a quiet vow rising in her silence. Jonah whispered, "Every absence leaves coordinates we pretend not to see." Mira's voice softened, momentary compassion breaking through armor. Mira said, "His loss seeded the doubt we now follow." Clara's breath quivered, memory sharpening its claws. Clara said, "I was left with questions that never stopped knocking." The narrator marked how pain carved maps more durable than ink. Elena said, "Then we finished the chart he began." That evening, the narrator found them reviewing Clara's faded graphs by lantern light. The cabin now an altar of persistence. Elena traced equations with reverence, seeing ghosts coded in symbols. Elena said, "He proved the horizon widens and contracts like a living thing." Jonah's tone carried awe and fear together. Jonah said, "This would rewrite every lecture hall." Mira folded her arms, unwilling to let hope run wild. Mira said, "But Vale will bury this again if we don't move faster." Clara looked at her hands as if guilt still lived under her skin. Clara said, "I froze when truth asked me to keep it alive." The narrator marked how tragedy could also become fuel when sorrow finally burned to ash. When dawn returned, the narrator felt the desert sigh with reluctant light. Clara handed Elena a key, tarnished brass heavy with history. Clara said, "This was his, the only thing recovered after the night he vanished." Elena closed her fist around it, eyes burning with quiet resolve. Elena said, "This opens more than doors, it opens debts." Jonah exhaled, his fear laced with determination. Jonah said, "Vale's walls cannot stop ghosts walking back in." Mira laid a hand on Clara's shoulder, steady but tender. Mira said, "You gave us the weight to move forward." Clara's voice cracked like fragile porcelain. Clara said, "Then promise me the silence ends here." The narrator marked how tragedy became catalyst, and how Act 5 carried the story into fire. Dawn broke over the observatory like a verdict written in frost, and the narrator watched Elena unlock the dome with Clara's tarnished key, as if turning memory into torque. The capture rigs hummed, ready to mirror the widened radius before policy could smother it. Jonah said, "Uplink tunnel is clean for 9 minutes if no one breathes wrong." Mira studied the log windows where numbers marched like soldiers whose orders were sealed. Elena said, "We publish a preprint and stream the raw, so deletion becomes confession." The dome rotated with a patient groan that made courage sound mechanical and honest. A private message appeared on Elena's screen with credentials that matched their ghost server. Adrian said, "Use this route and you will outrun Vale." The narrator felt the room cool as trust flickered like a fluorescent tube. Mira said, "Routes handed to fugitives often loop back to the jailer." Jonah said, "We split the stream and watch which pipe bleeds." Elena said, "Truth goes first, and fear can follow if it must." The narrator followed their packets as they left the dome and flowed into the world like a river dodging dams, and for a moment, hope felt aerodynamic. Elena said, "Preprint seeded, checksum verified, mirrors alive." Jonah tracked the split streams, his eyes moving like a metronome set to crisis. Jonah said, "Adrian's route is fast, too fast for a campus backbone." Mira frowned, reading the tracer lines that bent where physics did not. Mira said, "Ghost relays, resolve inside the medical wing again." A silent alarm icon blinked, small as a lie that plans to grow teeth. Adrian said, "You asked for speed, and I delivered survival." The narrator mocked how gratitude can curdle when the invoice arrives first. "What?" Elena said, "Cut his route and keep the public mirrors screaming at full." Vale's injunction notice slid onto their screen, polite as a knife in a velvet sheath. "Vale," said, "cease transmission, or lose everything you borrowed." Elena said, "Then we owe you nothing, and keep the sky." By mid-morning the narrator felt pressure shift, as security logs stacked like snowdrifts, and the dome lights dimmed to survival. A backdoor handshake resolved with a signature that smelled of habit and comfort. Mira said, Adrian's credentials are Vale's old skeleton keys. Jonah's jaw set, and the drive seemed heavier, as if gravity collected interest on disobedience. Jonah said, one relay stayed open and piped our draft to a private review board. Adrian's voice turned smooth, a salesman forgiving unpaid debts. Adrian said, I protected you from deletion while the board verifies merit. Elena said, you sold time we did not ask to buy. The narrator counted the distance between rescue and ransom and found it shorter than rumor. Vale, said Independent Review, ensures accuracy. The phrase tasted like a locked door that thanks you for knocking. Elena said, accuracy without integrity is choreography. The room agreed by staying very still. The narrator took them to the university hearing room where neutral carpets pretend to drink blood, and the board assembled like a weather system with names. Vale said, we must quarantine compromised data for the integrity of the institution. Elena brought Clara's folder and set it down as if naming the dead in a room that feared echoes. Elena said, this pattern predates your policies and outlives your locks. Clara stood at the doorway, grief steady as a metronome that refuses new time signatures. Clara said, he vanished when this widening first appeared. Adrian adjusted his cuffs, a gesture that practiced innocence until it looked natural. Adrian said, security failures are unfortunate, but caution saved their work. The narrator marked betrayal arriving dressed as prudence, and leaving with applause it did not earn. Mira said, caution that edits the sky is not caution. Jonah said, our mirrors match the desert capture with brutal agreement. Vale smiled, and the smile did not reach his eyes. Evening gathered like a closing argument, and the narrator watched Elena in the dome as the final stream aligned with the galactic core and refused to blink. Elena said, we mirror to public nodes outside any campus and sign with open keys. Jonah nodded, his fear now an instrument tuned to resolve. Jonah said, 4 mirrors, overseas, 1 on a citizen science network. Mira stood at the hatch, a sentinel unwilling to blink first. Mira said, if they cut us, the sky will keep talking elsewhere. Vale entered without hurry, his presence like a cold draft that knows your name. Vale said, consider your careers concluded. Adrian hovered on the stairs and did not descend, a man measuring tides he thought he owned. Adrian said, let the review finish, and you will be vindicated. Elena said, vindication that arrives late is a funeral with speeches. The stream locked, and the widened radius drew itself live, a line no longer willing to be erased. Night wrapped the dome in quiet voltage, and the narrator felt time thin as the stream stabilized on the core. Elena said, we test the interior volume, model live. Jonah aligned the solver breath, measured like countdowns. Jonah said, echo timings predict growth behind the line. Mira watched the logs, a guard at the edge of an idea that bites. Mira said, if this holds, textbooks molt. Vale entered, carrying authority like weather that ignores roofs. Vale said, cease this theater. Adrian hovered in the doorway, his smile apologizing for everything and nothing. Adrian said, let the board finish, and you win clean. Elena said, truth first, permissions later. The solver unfurled a map of the unseeable, a throat widening with each pulse. The narrator marked the hinge where wonder outvoted fear. The narrator watched the stream fracture into harmonics that behaved like lanterns tossed into a well. Elena said, the echoes arrive late, as if space learned to hoard room. Jonah's fingers danced, stitching delay curves to mass flow. Jonah said, interior volume scales faster than exterior area. Mira's voice softened, awe smuggling warmth past caution. Mira said, a lung that expands after every swallow. Vale's jaw set, a verdict forming behind patience. Vale said, your metaphors cheapen risk. Adrian leaned closer to Elena's screen, like a moth that loves glass. Adrian said, "I can smooth the jitter." Elena said, "Do not touch the proof." The narrator felt gravity tilt inside the room, while the graph climbed like a vow that refuses stairs. An alert chimed, small as guilt, and the narrator saw a hidden relay wake behind their mirrors. Mira said, "Adrian's route just reopened." Jonah traced the hop and found the medical wing like an old scar. Jonah said, "They are staging a rollback." Vale looked almost kind, an expression borrowed from diplomacy. Vale said, "We will curate the release to avoid panic." Elena's voice cut cleanly, a scalpel that remembered the wound. Elena said, "Curate means erase the part that convicts you." Adrian's smile failed and showed bone. Adrian said, "I did what kept your work alive." The solver flashed a new fit that matched Clara's ancient frames. The narrator named the moment betrayal lost its costume, and truth refused to blink. The narrator heard the stairwell door open like a page turning, and Clara entered, carrying the weight of years as if it were a lantern. Clara said, "He died because data was trimmed to fit a story." Silence bent around her as the solver replayed the widening from decades ago. Elena said, "Your frames fit our live pulse like a spine meeting ribs." Vale's eyes flickered, a storm blinking behind glass. "Vale," said Tragedies, "do not license chaos." Clara set the old key on the console, its tarnish an argument that needs no rhetoric. Clara said, "Your caution killed a scientist." Adrian looked down, as if shoes could forgive him. The narrator felt the room decide to remember, and memory made a louder sound than law. The narrator marked the final minutes as the model closed, and the sky signed its name. Elena said, "Interior volume grows beyond the horizon while the surface stays strict." Jonah nodded, the numbers carving clarity where rumor lived. Jonah said, "Echo delays reveal a throat that lengthens with every fall." Mira faced the camera and spoke like a witness sworn by light. Mira said, "Curation ends tonight." Vale stared at the live feed that no injunction could silence. Vale said, "History will judge methods, not zeal." Clara's voice carried the missing into the room. Clara said, "Then let history hear this." Elena published the bundle to open nodes, a door flung wide to a hall with no walls. The narrator closed Act 7, knowing the truth cost careers, and returned a voice to the lost.